I'd just like to give a slight background on who we are at WestCOG, Western Connecticut Council of Governments. If you're not from Connecticut, because I know it's got a wide distribution, Connecticut has a bunch of councils of governments. We're kind of like the regional entities that provide planning resources for our towns. And some of the research we did at WestCOG was about flooding and investigating the land use and zoning policies behind it, and also a program to try to help towns and homeowners with it. So that's what this presentation is all about. That's what Charlie and Jaci are presenting today. And without further ado, I will pass it off to Charlie and Jaci.
Thanks, Mike. I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining today. We have great turnout. We're very appreciative to be a part of Connecticut's Sustainability and Resiliency Week, among a lot of other great presentations. My name is Jaci Reelick. I'm a project manager for WestCOG, and I manage, as Mike mentioned, our Regional Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program. For those who aren't familiar with it, it's a program we provide to our region and our communities to help with flooding assistance. We provide technical assistance in FEMA's hazard mitigation assistance grant programs. So we help with things like determining grant eligibility, developing the application with you, and even providing post-award management support. I'm also joined by my colleague, Charlie Viddick, Senior Project Manager for WestCOG, who is responsible for land use and zoning issues pertinent to floodplain management. So today we're going to be presenting the research that Charlie has primarily conducted over the last 4 years on flooding and the role of land use and zoning as it pertains to flooding impacts in Connecticut. We're going to address strategies for reducing flooding and its impacts on water quality, and we're also going to cover how these topics relate to and impact our regional flood program and lessons learned along the way. As Mike mentioned, we're recording this session. We're going to post the session as well as the slides on our website and on YouTube. And we also just want to note, if you want to use this webinar towards land use training, you're welcome to do so as well. So before we move on to the next slide, I just want to draw your attention to the title slide if it's not already there. This is a really great picture that just really showcases the extent that these natural disasters and flooding disasters can have on our state. This picture, I believe it was taken in Monroe from the August flooding disaster that we had last year. So, I mean, a picture paints 1,000 words. You can just see how much damage occurred from this storm. And I think I can speak for most of us when I say that it was unexpected and more intense than a lot of us were prepared for. So we're excited to talk today about some different strategies that you can take at the local level to hopefully better prepare for these types of disasters. Next slide. So this is a really great quote that Charlie found to kick off the presentation today. Floods are acts of God, flood losses are acts of man. While we all know that natural disasters are inevitable and Mother Nature is going to take its course no matter what we do, we can't prevent the disaster, but we can really control the extent of damages that occur from these disasters. So we can work together to prepare for and respond to the disasters in a way that minimizes threat and damage to the environment and our communities by implementing best practices, which is what we're going to discuss today. Next slide. So this is just an overview of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to review the current state of affairs, how floodplain regulations are managed across the state, status of flood insurance studies and rate maps, flood compensation, how far above the 100-year flood makes sense, and some important flaws in the FEMA regulatory program, especially with respect to water quality and septic system management. And then we're also at the end going to review some important action items that all planners should consider for floodplain management. Next slide. So this is our problem statement for today's presentation. The 100-year flood is a statistical construct based on data that no longer hold. In a world of wetter storms and rising sea levels, the so-called 100-year flood gives an inaccurate and frankly dangerous impression of the frequency and magnitude of flooding events. And according to a Northeast study, the 100-year flood actually now occurs on a 60-year interval. And the reason for this is because of climate change, increasing storm intensities, and extended rainfall events that make this data obsolete. It's important to also understand that the sharp delineation of the 100-year floodplain with distinct boundaries is purely a modeler's conjecture. It's subject to confidence limits, which means that the actual 100-year floodplain may be more or less than established by the firm maps. But in view of changing climate, increased development in the floodplain, local governments need to plan for more resilient and protective standards for new development. And what this means, as we'll show you throughout today's presentation, is either prohibiting development in the floodplain or establishing much more restrictive freeboard above the base flood. Slide. So this chart is a good overview, taking a look at how flood prevention regulations are managed or administered across the state by municipality. Unlike land use controls for residential and commercial development found in zoning, you can see that floodplain management is not consistently managed across the board. And the result of this is that we have inconsistent approaches to floodplain management based on FEMA's flood insurance regulations, with little consideration of traditional setback or buildable lot standards as a means to control development cited in these locations. Before we go to the next slide, because this will be important for what we're going to talk about, I want to draw your attention to the distribution here. So if you look towards the top of the chart, you'll see that only 2 out of 169 municipalities in the state of Connecticut have designated town floodplain managers managing the floodplain. Over 50% are planning, building, and zoning officials that are actually managing the floodplain. Next slide. And now, while of course municipal staff like planning and zoning staff probably do have moderate training in flood management, I'm sure they have higher education degrees, there is a chance that they might not have the equivalent subject matter specific training as floodplain managers do. Not to mention, I think it's common that local government positions often have a handful of responsibilities or tasks. They wear many hats, not just one. So I think that although floodplain management could be part of their role, it might not be their sole focus, and therefore they might lack the staff capacity to advance floodplain regulation when it's needed most. So one potential solution is encouraging local governments to get more CFMs or certified floodplain managers. Certified floodplain manager is a professional who's obtained certification through the Association of State Floodplain Managers and is responsible for administering and implementing federal, state, and local regulations related to floodplain management. Becoming a CFM, it could be less intensive than some other certification programs. You have to prepare for and take the exam. And once you pass, take continuing education credits every 2 years to stay on top of your field. And while not required, it's recommended that you have 2 years of experience in the field, a higher education degree, and you've completed FEMA's floodplain management course. But regardless of the requirements or recommendations for becoming a CFM, the study plan is robust. ASFPM has a library full of really great resources that teach floodplain management best practices and knowledge that instills deep-rooted subject matter expertise. According to ASFPM, the certification program will lay the foundation for ensuring that highly qualified individuals are available to meet the challenge of breaking the flooding damage cycle and stopping its negative drain on the nation's human, financial, and natural resources. So the key takeaway here is having a dedicated local CFM on staff would be extremely beneficial for evaluating and improving flood regulations because of their subject matter expertise and building that local in-house capacity. Many municipal staff might already be halfway there. They probably have the experience and they have the education, so they just need to take it one step further. An alternative option here too is to have a regional CFM. This would be specifically beneficial because not only would this reduce the burden on each municipality to build in-house capacity, but it would also really help tighten the consistency across municipal borders. Because you'll see a common theme throughout this presentation. Flooding has no borders. It's not going to stop at the border of a municipality. It's going to go where it wants to go. So I think it's important that a key takeaway here today is that regionalization can be really beneficial. Slide. So another key issue we want to talk about today is the status of flood insurance studies in Connecticut. If you look on the right-hand side, you'll see the number of municipalities and the year of their flood insurance studies. 83% are out of date as of 2025. Now, you might be thinking, well, of course, it takes some time to update these, but even if you look at this table here, the bulk that are outdated are from 10, 15 years ago, not just within the last couple of years. FEMA usually calls for a 5-year update to these studies because, of course, as you see on the left-hand side, climate change, increases in impervious land coverage, and lack of riparian corridor protections are all going to change the floodplain and change the conditions. And it's important that we stay up to date on this so that we can make the best informed decisions. Next slide. Similar to flood insurance studies, flood insurance rate maps are 93% out of date as of 2025. And again, I want to draw your focus to the table here. We have the bulk that are outdated 15, 20, 25 years ago. I can certainly speak to the fact that I think that the floodplain and the conditions have significantly changed in the last 20, 25 years. Really, the key takeaway here on this slide, as we've learned, flood insurance studies, flood insurance rate maps, they're both very out of date. The key takeaway for the flood insurance rate maps or the firms is that this is a public facing tool. You can see your flood risk with these maps. And if they're outdated, the public's not being apprised of their real flood risks. Next slide. So what are some implications to having an outdated study or map? Well, number one, that might be a little obvious is inaccurate insurance rates. If a study that was conducted 20, 25 years ago is out of date, the floodplain has changed, well, that data is out of date and maybe there's a property that's no longer in the floodplain. Maybe it's now in the floodplain or part of the property is now in the floodplain. And therefore, property owners might be paying too much or too little for flood insurance. Number two, there might be development going on in areas that now might be covered by the floodplain or partially covered by the floodplain that weren't at the time of the study. And of course, I think we can all assume there's some significant consequences there because maybe you're looking at old data and you're getting it approved to develop on a property, when in reality, if that data were reevaluated to today, it would show you that your flood risk is much higher and that developing here can have some serious repercussions. You're also going to have a lack of present day vulnerabilities. Similarly, because the floodplain may change over time, there might be, the communities might be overlooking hazard mitigation planning for areas that are not located in a flood zone based on old data. This could lead to a lack of disaster preparation and response to vulnerable areas, especially critical infrastructure like hospitals that are crucial to emergency response. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about grant eligibility. When it comes to our regional flood assistance program that we provide, part of our assistance that we do is helping property owners determine if they're eligible for these grants. And in order to be eligible, FEMA wants to see that your project's cost effective. And we do this by performing what's called a benefit cost analysis. And when we do this BCA analysis, we're really relying pretty heavily most of the time on elevation data, for example, the base flood elevation. So typically, for example, to put it into perspective, if a house has its first floor, which is the threshold that we use in these calculations, if the first floor is above the BFE, it might not or would likely not be a cost-effective project because technically speaking, your livable space is above the floodable elevation. So for example, let's say your property has a first floor elevation of 12 feet and the BFE based on the current flood insurance rate map is 10 feet. Well, maybe it's not going to be very cost effective because you're above that floodable area. But if we were to reevaluate this data and update this study, say 15, 20 years later, maybe the BFE is now raised due to climate change and increase, impervious surface or development. And now that BFE is at 14 feet. So now technically speaking, you're 2 feet below the BFE at your livable space. So your flood risk is much higher than the current data is showing. And that could make you ineligible for a grant when really you might be eligible if we were to update these studies and maps. Next slide. Another key issue we want to talk about is compensatory storage regulations. Compensatory storage is a flood risk management technique where any volume of floodwater storage capacity that's lost due to development in the floodplain needs to be replaced or compensated for by creating an equivalent volume of new flood storage elsewhere in the floodplain. A key element for those municipalities that allow development in the floodplain is the need to provide these compensatory measures when development impinges upon the floodplain. Arguably, no development should occur in the floodplain, but it's not always feasible. So when it is allowed, efforts should be made to ensure that new development doesn't increase downstream flooding. Similarly here, we talked about how flooding doesn't have borders. We also know that flooding and water, it all flows downstream, it all goes down south. It's just common knowledge. So the decisions that you're making upstream or within your municipality can really have great effects downstream. And that's why issues like compensatory storage are so important. Next slide. So to drive this point further, planning upstream is going to protect your downstream, and the flood control decisions you make for your town are greatly going to impact not just your own town, but your southern neighbors. All water's flowing downstream, so proper upstream planning can ensure that you're not putting downstream communities or other properties within your municipality at risk. There's been many cases in our experience with our flood program where some communities or even property owners have identified their sources of flooding as limited infrastructure or lack of regulation, possibly in a neighboring town. One potential strategy here, again, similar to a regional CFM, is having a regional staff member, for example, from a council of governments like us, that could take on a more involved role and review floodplain regulations for all of our municipalities so that we can ensure consistency across the board. Next slide. All right, so we've mentioned the 100-year floodplain or the BFE a couple times, so we want to dive into a little bit more detail in talking to you about how much above the freeboard is the right amount or what might work for you. So the base flood elevation is established by flood insurance rate maps based on the repetitive flood insurance studies. You see this chart here, nearly half of all municipalities, 49%, allow new development to be just at the base flood elevation. This is quite the gamble when you consider the ever-changing climate and consistent increase in storm intensity. At the time of new development, you might be in the clear by developing at the BFE, but there's a high probability that it will flood at some point in the near future. And that's why planning needs to happen for the future conditions, not just the present. Next slide. The state building code has established requirements for new development in the floodplain, and that's since October 2018. It has to be above 1 foot, 1 foot above the base flood elevation. This precautionary principle should drive towns to set their freeboard above the BFE even higher to anticipate the future development and future intense storms that I just mentioned. The key is not planning to meet the current conditions, but those that are anticipated 50 years from now when there's more development, more intense storms, and more loss of forest canopy due to flooding, hurricanes, and loss of trees through disease. Next slide. Well, we want to take it a step further and say that the building code of BFE plus 1 foot is still not enough. Reasons being, we did touch on many of these key points here. Compensatory storage, there's a lack of adequate enforcement there, lack of riparian corridor protections. We've had an increase in impervious land coverage over the last 50 years because, of course, we're going to continue to develop. Outdated data, failure to address critical infrastructure, and dependence on flood insurance in lieu of land use controls when it comes to flooding damage. And one other thing I want to mention is that Charlie found a FEMA study that found that a 2-foot BFE standard is not only more protective, but it only raised construction costs by about 2% over existing standards. Next slide. So interestingly, to build upon the 2-foot BFE standard in that FEMA study, if you're going to go for a FEMA funded home elevation, this is from experience with our regional flood assistance program, If a property owner wants to elevate their home and they're going to apply for a grant, a FEMA grant to fund this, the state of Connecticut requires that you elevate your home to the 500-year elevation, not 100-year, but the 500-year elevation plus 2 feet. And to put that into perspective, for coastal communities, in order to calculate this 500-year elevation, we have to consider sea level rise. So we multiply the 500-year elevation by 1.25 feet. So if you do the math, most coastal communities have a BFE of around 10 to 17 feet within that range. So if you do that calculation, if you're going to go for a FEMA funded elevation, most coastal homes are going to have to raise at least 4 to 6 feet above the BFE. Now, you might think that that's pretty significant, but on the next slide, I'm going to put it into a little bit more perspective for you. So this is a great overview here of what does it look like for the extra cost of raising those extra feet. What are you saving in terms of insurance and the payback period? So these two tables are pulled from the FEMA 2008 supplemental to the 2006 evaluation of NFIP's building standards. The data showcases that, of course, although the higher you build, the more it's going to cost you. You not only save significant money in your insurance premium because it's going to go down as you raise away from the hazard, but you're also going to make back the money that you've spent for that extra freeboard over time. And it's a pretty short period. I mean, if you look at the V zone, the highest payback period is 3 years. So maybe in the short term, you're spending that extra money, but you're making that money back in 3 years because you're preventing further damages from happening. And not to mention, if you look at the bottom table here, it puts it into even simpler terms. Construction cost goes up, insurance premium savings goes up, but your risk level goes down significantly the higher you raise your house. So you're not just saving money, but you're also saving stress and worry because you know that your risk level is decreasing. Next slide. So this is just a good overview of the state of Connecticut, all of our municipalities and what their current regulations require for new development. You can see that there's a wide distribution here, but coastal municipalities have generally recognized the need to establish construction of new development at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation. More importantly, there's a growing number of municipalities that recognize the need for even greater protections given the ever increasing frequency of floods that are supposedly only supposed to occur every 100 years. And we actually now even have 4 municipalities that have chosen at least a 4-foot freeboard for new construction in the 100-year floodplain. And we hope that more municipalities follow this. Next slide. So this chart here is showing the total amount of flood insurance claim payments since 1978. As you can see, flood losses are not insignificant. Coastal communities, Fairfield and New Haven, combined have $412 million combined since 1978. In total, all the communities on this chart here total just over $500 million in claims, which is very significant. So it just shows you that if we work together and we work towards better floodplain management and implement a lot of different strategies that Charlie's going to talk about, we can really reduce this number. So I'm going to turn it over to Charlie now, and he's going to take you through some important water quality issues related to flooding, as well as alternative approaches to strengthening local floodplain regulations.
Well, thanks, Jackie. We're going to switch over to some land use issues that you may not be as familiar with. And water pollution is one of the concerns that we deal with when we have floodplain management as a land use issue. So the 100-year floodplain has not received the water quality protections granted to inland wetlands. This condition not only makes septic systems inoperable where flooding occurs routinely, it also contributes to the degradation of Connecticut's water courses and the hypoxic conditions in Long Island Sound. The Connecticut Public Health Code does not address this problem. Only 2 towns in Connecticut, Killing and Union, and recognize the shortcomings of FEMA's model regulations when it comes to water quality protections established for septic system leaching fields. So this is an important element of floodplain management. So let's just go to the next slide. The need for a 2-foot elevation above the base flood for the septic system leaching field is a key recommendation that all municipalities should have. It should be at least over 2 feet because it's really the aerobic conditions that need to exist at the bottom of the leaching field for the leaching field to operate properly. This approach not only protects the integrity of the leaching field, it protects water quality for downstream municipalities. And this is an important issue because we're not just talking about water quantity, the magnitude of floods, but also water quality implications of floodplain management. So let's also talk about another aspect here. Water pollution is a function of both elevation and separation. Unlike Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection septic effluent standards that create a one-size-fits-all approach to effluent attenuation, other states have established effluent separation distances from rivers based on volume discharge as well as soil conditions. And these are some important opportunities for us to learn from our sister states. These standards are not consistent with the latest science on bacterial survival times, nor the worst case conditions that can emerge when all climate, soil, and slope factors are not considered. For example, if 21-day effluent travel time and a 50-foot separation from surface water or a drinking water well are really not sufficient. Leaching fields should be set back really at least 100 feet from rivers. More importantly, if a septic system leaching field must be installed, it should be with the drainage field elevated at least 2 feet above the base flood elevation or at a level that allows aerobic treatment of the effluent. We know this is an issue, and it is an important opportunity to not only deal with the quantity issue, but the quality issues that flooding create. So let's just go over to, from a land use point of view, there's 2 issues we'll talk about, the buildable lot and impervious cover issue. So we'll start with the buildable lot. Many of you may not be familiar with this. In Connecticut, 150 municipalities have buildable lot standards, but not all of them are based on environmental considerations. So the key is the development of the buildable lot concept focused on specific issues, wetlands, floodplains, steep slopes, and shallow to bedrock. And so we have those issues emerging as important considerations, but specifically we'll focus on the floodplain consideration in the buildable lot standard. There are 43 municipalities that have actually addressed this issue. Did I go the wrong way? There we go. Make sure I go to the right one here. Yeah, and hold on, going back to where I should be. And okay. Sorry about that. I pushed the wrong button. And here we go. So this chart shows you the municipalities in Connecticut that have established an exclusion or a deduction for floodplains for determining whether a lot is buildable. For those who have excluded the 100-year floodplain from being considered buildable, over 90% have done this, and that's the 32 municipalities that you see at the bottom here. But then there's the remaining 10% or 4 municipalities that have excluded 75% or more of the floodplain land on any given lot from being considered developable. These land use regulations are an invaluable tool to minimize or eliminate development in the floodplain. And the focus here, of course, is on new development. And it would also, in some cases, apply to alteration and renovation and reconstruction projects. So This is an important tool. The buildable lot tool really was one that emerged in the late 80s in Coventry, Connecticut, with the help of Mike Ziska, who is an environmental attorney who's really done some yeoman's work in developing more sophisticated land use principles. So let's talk about the second issue that zoning commissions have done to address flooding through land use controls. Based on a WestCOG analysis of the 167 municipalities with zoning, there's a need to modernize land cover standards. Lot cover standards were not designed as a flood management tool. Historically, lot cover standards go back to the 1925 State Enabling Act, but impervious cover standards is a more recent phenomena. In contrast to lot cover, impervious cover standards can help reduce stormwater runoff and downstream flooding. Only 45 municipalities have adopted impervious cover standards for new development in Connecticut. Adopting impervious cover standards can play an important long-term role in reducing stormwater runoff at the watershed level, but only if all municipalities recognize its benefits in reducing the impact of the 100-year flood or even more frequent 2-year, 24-hour peak flooding events. So let's take a look at the importance of the issue as it was presented in the 2024 Stormwater Quality Manual, which for the first time has begun to look at impervious cover as an important land use consideration. So you'll see here that the Connecticut Stormwater Quality Manual states that excessive impervious land cover has at least 8 direct impacts that affect the intensity, severity, and speed of flooding. Impervious cover also affects the base flow conditions in our state's rivers and streams and adversely affects the ability to maximize ground coverage, recharge. Numerous studies have found that when impervious cover within a watershed reaches 20 to 30%, the 100-year flood can double in magnitude. For example, a 2020 study published by the Geophysical Research Letters Journal found floods increased by 3.3% for each 1% increase in impervious cover. This is another way of saying that when a watershed reaches 20 to 30% impervious cover, the 100-year flood doubles in magnitude compared to pre-development conditions. Let's also not forget that the chance of the 100-year flood happening during the lifetime of a 30-year home mortgage is not 1%. It is 26%. That's actually a 1 in 4 chance of it happening if you stay in your home for the life of the mortgage. And a lot of people don't think about it that way. So the issue about 1% chance of flooding all depends on how long you're going to be living in your home. So we'll go to the next slide. So on the left-hand side of this slide is the density map of repetitive loss properties in Western Connecticut. For those who don't know, a repetitive loss property is a property that has suffered 2 or more flood losses of $1,000 or greater, each in any 10-year rolling period since 1978. A severe repetitive loss property is any property with 4 or more flood losses of more than $5,000 each, or 2 or more claim payments where the total exceeds the property value. There are 937 repetitive loss or severe repetitive loss properties in the Western Connecticut region, 88% of which are coastal communities. If you notice from these 2 slides, the higher concentration of repetitive loss properties is not just along the coastal cities, towns, but also in the city of Danbury. Similarly, you can see on the right that the impervious cover, surface coverage mimics almost the exact same distribution. A higher concentration of impervious coverage along the coastal communities in hotspots in the city of Danbury. So this is not a mere coincidence. It's reaffirming what I said on the previous slide the higher the impervious cover, the more flooding you have, and it's reflected in the repetitive loss locations that we have in Western Connecticut. So some observations that I'd like to make here about outdated floodplain standards. There are three key issues that as town planners, if you are one on this call, you may wish to address. First, the need to urge FEMA to update your town's flood insurance study if it's over 5 years old. Second, to address the need for higher standards of protection for critical infrastructure, as Governor Lamont has set forth in Executive Order 21-3. Only Stamford has done that within the Western Connecticut region. Third, riparian setbacks or buffers play a critical role in reducing hypoxic conditions in Long Island Sound. However, more importantly, in this context of this presentation, they also function as a tool to reduce development and impervious cover in the 100-year floodplain, because basically riparian buffer zones are also an overlay to floodplains and serve an important function in reducing the speed and intensity of flooding along the rivers when they do exist, whether they're forested canopies or whether they're grassed. The last thing we want is parking lots along riparian corridors if we're looking to reduce flooding. So I'm going to give a few conclusions here. So let's summarize what we have discussed. First, FEMA and the building code do not adequately address climate change or flooding in Connecticut. The 100-year floodplain is a statistical construct, and as such, it is subject to continuous change as the variables of climate, land use, tree canopy coverage are subject to constant change. Research shows that minimum base flood elevation +2 is not only more effective, but only raises costs by 2%. Even at 3 or 4 feet above the base flood elevation, while costs increase, insurance premium savings increase, and flood risks decrease. The good news is that Connecticut general statutes authorize local governments to establish more restrictive standards for flood prevention under Section 8-2L, which is part of the Connecticut zoning enabling law. Specifically, those regulations indicate, quote, a municipality may adopt more stringent restrictions for flood storage and conveyance of water for floodplains than those established by FEMA. Development in the 100-year floodplain is not just about protecting property, it's also about protecting water quality. In that regard, more protective septic system standards are needed for development within the 100-year floodplain. You might think of floodplain management as a challenge like that faced by an NFL quarterback at the scrimmage line. When the quarterback is going to pass the ball to the tight end, he doesn't toss the ball to where he is right now, but where he will be in 3 seconds from now. Similarly, as the quarterback for floodplain management, your challenge is anticipating where flood elevations and flood risk are expected to be in 30 to 50 years, not right now. That takes planning and anticipation based on emerging trends and what we might call a challenging meteorologically complex game plan. And now I will turn it over to Jaci. You're muted, Jaci.
Thank you. Thanks, Charlie. Hopefully you can hear me now.
Yep.
2 more conclusions that we want to discuss. As discussed early in the presentation, encouraging more CFMs, whether locally or regionally, would be a game changer for municipal floodplain regulation. Having a qualified professional with proven expertise in the field will lead to more informed decisions, dedicated capacity, and consistency across municipal borders. Another key takeaway from today's presentation is the need to address outdated flood insurance studies and rate maps. The consequences of making decisions based upon old data is more than you might expect. prevent further disturbance of the floodplain and increase in flood risk, communities are encouraged to approach FEMA for an update when necessary. But it's also important to identify what the gaps and barriers are to updating flood insurance studies. Is it time? Is it capacity? Is it funding? And working together, preferably regionally, to find solutions and alternative approaches. So really the key here, just like Charlie just described wonderfully with his analogy, is that floodplain management and regulation and flood prevention is really about planning for the future, planning for what's to come and not just for the present. Next slide. All right, so this is the end of the presentation, but you'll see some resources and references listed here on this page if you're looking to see more information on what we discussed today. We'll be posting all of this, so you should be able to access those links. But if we go to the next slide, Charlie, we also have our contact information here too. So if you have any further questions that we can't address today during Q&A, you're welcome to email Charlie or I with those questions. And thank you very much, everybody, for attending today. We had a great turnout and we hope you learned something. But I'll turn it over to Mike now so we can get started with some Q&A. We've got about 15 minutes.
Great. Thanks a lot, Jackie and Charlie. And I meant to give a shout out to the state of Connecticut, DEEP. They put together the Sustainability and Resilience Week. And judging by the numbers that we have attending today, it really is a huge help to kind of get everybody on the same topic to explore. So big thank you to the state of Connecticut for that. For questions, yeah, feel free to write them in the chat, raise your hand, or use the Q&A. If you haven't used the raise hand feature, it should be in the top row or the chat, and you can just write in there. I do have to acknowledge that we had some IT issues. I have no idea why, for some attendees, you're not seeing the shared screen. I really apologize about that. It might be server, IT, firewall, it might be settings. There could be a variety of issues. We'll try to see if we can prevent that more in the future. But you can download those slides. You can download this presentation once we get it on YouTube. So if you wanted to see those slides in action, it will be available for you. But let's take a moment and get some questions in play here. We have some already there, and I think I marked it with an eyeball. Let's see. Mike Vincelli. Oh, about the present administration looking to eliminate FEMA at the end of the current hurricane season. Where will funds come from, and what will happen to websites such as flood maps, etc.?
You want to take that, Jackie, or?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much help I could be to answer that
right.
question, because I think that we're all eager to see what's going to happen with the present administration. Of course, we really hope that maybe it's not a complete abolishment of FEMA, maybe some type of reform. But of course, unfortunately, we don't really have much information on what's going to happen. But we, as a regional agency, we're always looking for grant opportunities and ways to support, projects that we've done so far with this program. So if that truly does become a reality, we're certainly going to look at high and low to find other grant programs and funding resources to keep this work moving.
Yeah, and if I may add, in the National Flood Insurance Program Reform Act of 1994, FEMA allows municipalities to fund the development of flood insurance studies if towns want to put up the money. And so that is an option where money is tight. Whether or not FEMA is even going to be able to put up its 50% share will remain to be seen, but at least there is an option for these things to be done without total FEMA funds, but that of course puts a burden financially on municipalities or regions to do so.
Very good. Thanks, Charlie. I wasn't sure how much we could answer that question, but good job. Let's see. We have some. Dave Murphy wants to give a shout out to the annual flood conference coming soon. He gave a link, so you can see that in the chat, ctfloods.org, for the
Yep.
state annual flood conference.
And
Someone else
I
was asking.
believe,
Yeah, go
I was
ahead.
just going to make David's point. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Dave, but it's November 20th is the Connecticut Association of Floodplain Managers Conference. And so if you go to the link that Dave provided, you should be able to register for that.
All right. I do have everybody muted, so they're kind of handicapped, but thank you, Dave.
Well, I just checked, so we should be
Yeah.
good.
Good. And then where do people get floodplain manager training? I saw that answered. There's
Yeah, I'm going to just
CFM
throw
studies.
some links in there. Oh, somebody just put it in there.
Yep.
We have that one, and there's also a getting certified link as well that I'll drop in the chat. But yep, it's the Association of State Floodplain Managers. They have a ton of resources and walk you through the process.
Great. Deborah has a question. Are there recommendations for communities on how best to plan and who to reach out to help regarding flood preparedness in light of FEMA's many losses? I kind of read that broken up, so I can repeat the question.
Yep, I'm just reading it.
Okay, from Deborah there. The chat. Recommendations for communities on how to best plan for flood preparedness.
So I guess I'm just maybe to clarify. So you're looking for recommendations for communities on when you say FEMA many losses. So like when we talked about repetitive flood loss, feel free to clarify in the chat. I mean, of course, we can be a resource to you, you know, with everything that we do with our program. Reaching out to your state contact, the National Flood Insurance Program Coordinator, Diane Ifkovich is probably a really great resource for that as well. Or the Hazard Mitigation Planning Officer, Ken Dumas, you know, all those people are great people to reach out to for some assistance. And we're of course happy to help as well. But if you have a more clarifying question, please feel free to clarify.
All right, thanks, Jackie. Our next question is from Delia Fay. Local health department. She thought they required septic systems to be 50 feet outside of wetlands, and wetlands include floodplains. So that should keep new systems out of the floodplain, correct? Also, I think Woodstock also requires the same thing in their regulations, but I don't work there anymore. Okay. So I guess yeah, go ahead, Charlie.
Well, first of all, floodplains are not what are listed in the public health code as being separated. A septic system leaching field must be separated from rivers and water courses and wetlands, but there is no explicit separation from floodplains, which is the root issue here, the weakness in our public health code. And this has only become more apparent with rising intensities of storms, which raises the water to make the leaching field non-functional, especially in floodplains. So it is a weakness that needs to be fixed in our public health code.
Thanks, Charlie. All right, if you still have questions, keep writing them in the chat, the Q&A. I'm in there now, the Q&A, but I don't prefer it, so I prefer the chat. So just keep it flowing in there. Last Q&A question I have here in the Q&A section is there an expected release date for new flood maps from the recent FEMA/USGS update? I don't know when they're coming, but I know they've been working on them for a long time, and they're definitely way past their previous planned release date. So I don't know if Charlie or Jacqueline have any thoughts on that.
I can speak to that. We've had the discussion for 3 years about the imminence of those plans coming out. And there have been some improvements because I've looked at the status of all the plans in 2022 and again just this last month. And oddly enough, the ones that have been improved are the ones that are the more recent ones, like updating a 2010 flood insurance rate map to maybe 2020. But the older ones, and it turns out the oldest flood insurance rate maps are all in the northeast and northwest part of our state. And they remain very outdated. especially in places like Mansfield, Connecticut, which have had enormous amount of impervious cover and development. So the imminence of this, a lot has to do with fiscal issues with it, FEMA, and they have not been able to keep up with the requirement of a 5-year review process on the flood insurance rate maps and the flood insurance studies. It's a weakness of the entire system, not just Connecticut.
Very good. Next question is from Brian Pudlick. He wants to know that you indicated that 45 municipalities have impervious cover regulations. Is that
Yes.
list available? Is that part of the report, or is that something we can make available?
Yes, that actually, if you look at the sources that we listed at the end of our presentation, you'll find it in the WestCOG study for the riparian corridor study and in the buildable lot study. Those will be listed in those studies, the actual municipalities that have the impervious cover standards. The 45 that do have it are listed in one of those 2 documents. You'll find
Very
those
good.
on our website.
Excellent. Thanks, Charlie. All right, let's see. We got people sharing links of studies and exam info. Concerns about FEMA. People are happy about the presentation. Thank you. Here we go. Hiram Peck. Is that a question? Oh, no, that's a response.
And by the way,
discussions going on. No questions. Any more questions?
Yeah, I also it's on page 40 of the study we did for that last question. The case for riparian corridor protections. If you download the study and go to page 40, you'll find the list.
Yep, and I just put the links for all your reports in the chat, Charlie, so people can click
good.
on them now if they want to see it before we post it on our website.
Yeah, page 40 of that riparian corridor study.
Excellent. All right, I'm not seeing any more questions. Last call for questions. All right. Well, seeing none, I think we just want to give a shout out to Jackie and Charlie for putting this together and taking the time to present. And a shout out to all of you for joining us. We'll make this available. Oh, good. We got some applause going on and reactions. And I look forward to doing more of these. I think there's a lot to share from the COGs and for planning, and this was a great opportunity for that. So thanks again, and we'll share this soon. Bye, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.